is July 4th, 2018. I'm Fran Duvall, your host today, and I'm pleased that here we are with Len Kalkwarf, our resident expert on the presidential libraries. Today we're going to start from the beginning and talk about George Washington. But, Len, welcome.
Thank you.
I just want to say something first.
Yes.
It's also today the 242nd anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which George Washington didn't sign.
Right.
Because he was away fighting the war. And as were three other of our founding fathers, Hamilton, John Jay, and who was Madison.
Madison.
They were not, Hamilton was with George Washington in New York or New Jersey, wherever they were at that point. And so, interestingly, he on the 9th of July that year, 1776, he read the entire Declaration of Independence to the troops out loud so they could all hear what they were fighting for, really. So it's exciting to think about where he was, and yet he was our first president. You know, I'm glad for that. There are many other things about his life early on. Of course, he was a soldier, and he got up to the rank of general of the Continental Army, fought and won some battles, lost some in the whole fight for independence. A lot of those battles we all know about, and I'm not going to go into them here. One of the things that interested me about him was he had so many famous people that he was like a descendant of. And I was surprised at that when I read it. He was if you've done genealogy or anything, and they have all these sayings like second cousin, fourth removed, and all that. I don't really understand all that language, but just let me just run down. He had as an ancestor King Edward III, and that was back in the 14th century. He had a relationship somewhere along the line with Queen Elizabeth II. Even his adopted daughter married Robert E. Lee. He himself was also somewhere a descendant of Churchill. And I think I've seen a bust of Washington when I was over in England. I recall that. But anyway, that was interesting to me that he had all of these connections. So I imagine having to break from the British tradition that probably his family observed. It must have been tough to go into this whole independence thing. But anyway, I just wanted to say that he had a life before he became president, and a life that affected our country very much, very profoundly, really. I will say that someone said he commented that he thought the Declaration of Independence would last about the Constitution would last about 20 years. So here we are, a long way from that.
Yes.
Okay, now let's look at his presidency.
Okay. I think you mentioned about him being a soldier and so on. I think we want to remember that he also fought, not in just the Revolutionary War, but in what sometimes referred to as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. And at that time, he was part of the Virginia militia, and he was an officer. Then I understand what he tried to become an officer in the British Army after that, and he was turned down. And so after that, he resigned his commission. He got married, moved to Mount Vernon, and we know what happened when he was in Mount Vernon. And then, of course, he fought in the Revolutionary War. I'd like to mention a couple of things about him, just for us to get a better understanding of what kind of a man he was. And I understand from everything that I've read that he was the logical choice to become the president. There was no question in the minds of most people that he would become the president. In fact, there are those who feel that they kind of designed the office of the presidency at the time of the convention for him, for example. So he was kind of the logical choice because he was, first of all, he was so famous. And it's interesting, they say that he wanted to be famous, but not famous in the way we think of famous, more in the classical sense. Not getting his name in the newspaper or whatever, but he wanted to be remembered for doing something important and worthwhile, and kind of a service above, himself and so on. He's remembered, of course, as the man who got rid of the British, but he was also a well-known plantation person. He was a surveyor, landowner, and he sought to live rather quietly in his retirement after the Revolutionary War, but that didn't happen. He became the first president because he was so famous, and one of the things that stand out, at least in my mind, in terms of the kind of a man that he was, right after the Revolutionary War, it's called the Nuremberg conspiracy. The soldiers had not been paid. Some of them hadn't been paid for over a year, and they were demanding that they get their payment. And they thought what they would do is they would march on the Congress and demand their payment with bayonets. And they were hoping that he would lead them. And he turned them down because he said, in effect, what he was saying, we do not want the army to be in charge, because then after that we're going to have real difficulty. We'll have no democracy at all. And I suppose out of that comes the principle that even to this day the civilians are in charge of the military. So that was one of the things that he was is noted for, and I thought is a very important thing. As a man, he was very energetic. He was very, very active. In fact, it almost makes me tired when I read of some of the things that he was doing. They said that he would ride horses at a very rapid, very fast speed. He loved to gamble. He loved to play cards. He loved to dance. They said he danced at 3 hours in a stretch.
Wow.
Yeah. And he also enjoyed sitting around talking with his friends and drinking wine and gambling. And he liked fancy clothes. He would sometimes, as much as once a year, would order the latest fashion from London. So after the Revolutionary War, his idea of sport was to ride, even after those 8 years that he had been in the war, ride some 750 miles through New York wilderness looking for new land to speculate. So he was extremely active. Now, one of the things that he was concerned about, interested in, was transportation, building canals. And sounds strange in a way, but commerce moved by water at that time. And he wanted to build a canal from the Ohio River to the Allegheny Mountains to the Potomac River. And there is a lock here in Fairfax County of that old canal that they had built. And they had established a company, and he became the president of that company. And by the way, it didn't do well, but nevertheless, this was what they were trying to do. And his whole concern at that point was building canals and commerce. And so as a result of that, there were those who then got together and wanted to have a meeting in Annapolis to talk about commerce. And some of the well-known men were involved in that. Alexander Hamilton, Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia, and let's see, James Madison, of course, also, and John Dickinson from Delaware. And they were talking in terms of commerce, but out of that also grew the idea of the Constitutional Convention. It felt that, the Articles of Confederation were not sufficient. All of these men who met, and they had talked about this before, they were all nationalists. They all wanted a very strong federal government and do away with the Articles of Confederation. Now, some of the states did not want to send anybody to that particular conference because they suspected that they would be losing some of their power and their authority. The best known one who refused to go was the very good orator, the guy who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," Patrick Henry. He said, "I smell a rat." And he was concerned that they were not just going to revise the Articles of the Confederation, but they would put on a new constitution, and some of them were not in favor of that at all. In any event, out of that grew the idea of a constitutional convention, and so they met in Philadelphia in the same building where the Declaration of Independence had been written. Now, James Madison, who's noted for and remembered as the father of the Constitution, he already had a plan of the kind of constitution that our country ought to have. And he had already discussed this, obviously, with George Washington and some others. But when they went to Philadelphia to meet and to establish the convention, they were going to start at a certain day, but because of the travel difficulties and so on, there was no way that they could pinpoint that. And so actually, some of them, including Washington, they arrived some 11 days before the convention even started. And these fellows, most of them from Virginia, were the ones who already had an idea of a very strong federal government. And as they met for those 11 days before the convention started, they began to work out what they wanted in the federal government. Okay. It's interesting, these men who then later on sat down to develop a new constitution were very well educated. I'm very impressed when I read about what they were talking about. They went back to the philosophers of the 17th century, the rationalists, men like Descartes and Hobbes and Spinoza and others, and out of their thinking came that human beings, every human being was supposed to be free, and forget about this divine rights of the kings. That was not part of the rationalist idea, the natural thinking. So these men were well conversed in that. And by the way, there was about, I think, 44 men that gathered in Philadelphia to develop the Constitution. They were very well educated. In fact, I'm surprised at the number of them that went to college. Now, George Washington was among them, and by the way, George Washington did not go to college, but he did get an honorary doctorate from Harvard in 1776. But many of these men had gone to, not necessarily graduating, but they went to Harvard and they went to Yale. At least 10 of them went to Princeton, and several went to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. So they did have a very good educational background. John Locke was one of the philosophers that they referred to, and one of the points that John Locke said that people should have equal dignity before God, and also that government should be established to protect the people, and that the power comes from the people, and that was very much a part
Very
of it.
significant.
Okay. As they developed their idea, let's see, I'll go back to my notes here for a moment. They agreed also that the government should arise from the people, and there should be separation of power. Now, James Madison was very much concerned about people, men being corrupt and getting too much power
Too
for
much
themselves.
power, yeah.
In fact, somebody said that our Constitution, in one way, is a negative Constitution. Well, Madison was concerned that no one part of the government would be able to take over the other part. Again, the national government should be the dominant government. I'm sure that a lot of people at that time, and maybe even to this day, did not like what they were saying about the states, but some of them even felt that the state should be just an administrative body and have no power at all in terms of creating laws and so on. But okay, that was it. And they, of course, they proposed the two houses and so on. But where the big difficulty came at the Constitutional Convention was on the idea of the president, and what was he to be called, who was he to be, was it to be one man, one person, was it to be a committee? Well, George Washington felt that it should be one person, and even at that, a very limited amount of power was given to him. And when Washington did become the president, he was very careful not to become a monarch like some of the kings of Europe, for example. Well, of course, the Constitution was approved, but again, with limited power for the president. And when Washington became the president, the Constitution really was just a piece of paper. It had never been implemented, so Washington had to develop what the presidency was really going to be like. So we have to go back and look and see what Washington really did to determine, how he implemented the whole idea of the presidency. He was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789 as president. Again, there was no question that he would be elected. He was elected unanimously. He was elected unanimously in the second term, and then he refused a third term, and that kind of set the precedent for the future. And I think that was part of his idea as well. And it was the precedent until that of FDR, who then was elected and began to serve for 4 terms instead. John Adams became the vice president. And what I didn't know until recently was that John Adams and George Washington had some difficulty, had a little falling out here, because Adams did not want to go along with the idea of establishing a permanent army, and Washington did. And so ever since then, Adams was kind of pushed to the side. And he said that it was the most meaningless office ever created. And he isn't
the vice presidency.
Yeah, the vice president.
Yeah.
And he isn't the only one that said that. I mean, through the years, there's been others that said this.
We've heard it even in our lifetime.
Yes, that's for sure. Okay. One of the first things that Washington did, he did go and visit some of the different places in New England, kind of a presidential tour. The one place that he went that was recorded, he spoke at a synagogue in Rhode Island, and it's an excellent speech that he made there. And he said that there should be no bias against people of different religions. And he said he doesn't care whether they're Mohammed or Christian or Jew. There's no room for bigotry. So that's, and by the way, he never mentions Jesus Christ. which is an indication that the Constitution was never regarded as being a Christian document. It's not a religious document, it's a secular document. Maybe the majority are Christians, but it's still not a Christian nation.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. In 1790, this is right after he was inaugurated, the capital moved from New York to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia, by the way, was the largest city at the time, and it was more centrally located. One of the first things that Washington did was to establish, I think, the residency type, where they were going to build the White House. And of course, Washington he was the only president who never lived in the White House. The other thing was to establish a capital city. And Washington had chosen that area along the Potomac, on both sides of the Potomac. I think it's 20 square miles. And then he also engaged the architect to develop the city of Washington to be something like the capital of Moscow, capital of Russia,
yeah.
St. Petersburg, so with wide avenues and so on. That was his plan.
Yeah.
So, okay. The other thing that he did in terms of implementing the presidency, he developed his own cabinet. There were 4 people who were, and I offhand can't tell you who the 4 were, but these were his advisors. So he kind of started that idea of the cabinet. Now, the Constitution, as when you read it, which is the executive branch, is the second article in the Constitution. It doesn't give that much power to the president, but over the years, it kind of developed, became a stronger executive. Some because of the amendments, and others because of the men who became president, who really took more power and authority than they might have had otherwise. So, okay, those are basically the things that I wanted to mention about Washington as a.
Well, you know, you go on about our presidential libraries, but he didn't have a presidential library.
They call it a presidential library, but it is not really.
It's not one of the 13.
No, and it's
under the archives or whatever.
And I don't know how many of his papers are really there, like the other libraries, for example. Washington was also concerned that he would be overstepping his authority, and he was constantly deferring to the authority of Congress, fearful that he would do too much. And also, I was interested to read that his aide helped him to write his first inaugural address, and it turned out to be some 70 pages long.
Did you say 70?
70.
70.
Yes, and he realized that this was too much, and so George Madison came to Mount Vernon, and they sat down and they began to draft a new.
And you mean James Madison?
James Madison.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And one of the things that was in that first inaugural address was the need for a first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights.
Yeah. Of course, that was Madison's concern right from the beginning. I think that there should be that, so he helped that take place. Yeah. All right. Somebody said that the seed for an imperial presidency was right there, right from the beginning in that office, because the president was placed in charge of the diplomatic corps, and he was in charge of the armed forces. And being in charge of those two made him very, very powerful. So, okay. Washington was obviously a very able administrator. He had been a powerful administrator, as the head of the Continental Army. He had to deal with many, many different things, including dealing with foreign governments and so on. So he did very well that way.
Well, some things I read, it said he was so particular about, for instance, looking at receipts and making sure the accounting was correct. And he was a nitpicker.
He was something like Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, there you go.
On the minutia.
Let's look at every item. Yeah.
Well, you see that when you go and look at some of the records at Mount Vernon, how careful he had. Yeah.
And those ledgers.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. All right. That's about all that I.
Well, I think that this is. It's interesting when you two things I want to mention.
Yeah.
One is that there's those three important documents that we have.
Yeah.
The Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution. But wasn't the Constitution done before the Bill of Rights? Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So I should have said that second.
Yeah. Because they proposed 12. I think it was 12 or 13 in the Bill of Rights originally.
Yeah, and then
the Congress approved 10.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And now the other thing I wanted to say, it went out of my head. Oh, Len, what was your resource for all these? How many books do you have on this?
Well, I don't know. I have one that's in the presidential series that I have found to be extremely helpful.
Okay.
And there's one on every president.
Right.
And I have every one of them now. Yeah.
And who publishes that? Do you know?
I think it's Life magazine or Time magazine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And the other thing is on certain times, like the 1776. That book.
That book is excellent.
Yeah. And I think David McCullough did a book on George Washington. I think. I'm not sure.
Well, he did
John Adams, but
he did John Adams, and I think he also did Jackson. I think it was Jackson. Yeah.
Oh, he's done several of them.
Yes. Yeah.
But I know that you do a lot of reading on when you are presenting these shows. And so.
Well, a lot of this is very obvious for many things, but to go to the internet and one can go right to a particular subject. If you want to know something about a particular item, to go to the internet, and it's such a tremendous resource. It's like walking into the library and you don't have to go sort for the particular book. It's right there.
As long as you know the key word to put in.
That's right. It's
you
fantastic.
can look at that item. And it is amazing that resource to us.
For example, just this morning, I went to look about Braddock, who the road is right out here.
Braddock,
but
he was
this is part of the French-Indian War that he was involved in.
I see.
And Washington was the aide to him.
Yes.
He was killed during that war.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you, Len.
Okay.
And we'll look for this for the next president.
Although
we're going to resort back, aren't we?
We'll go back. Right now, the last one we did, we've been doing it in sequence. The last one was George H.W. Bush.
Okay.
So we'll just continue. We're very much up to almost the present time. And then when we're finished with that, I think we'll start from the beginning. We may not do Washington again.
We'll probably do Jefferson.
John Adams.
I mean Adams.
John,
and then
yes.
Jefferson. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay.